We've got compliance ramping up, which means you've got to focus more on converting your leads, which means you need to focus on the channels that they use the most. And one of them is text, and compliance is ramping up on text too.
All right. Hello, everybody. This is one of the many content pieces that we are putting together in the weeks and months ahead as we help the lead generation and performance marketing industry navigate the most recent FCC one-to-one consent rules and related updates to the TCPA, otherwise known as the Telephone Consumer Protection Act. We believe the content that we have put together will help you decode these changes with more confidence and a focus on compliance. The topic for today's webinar is Actionable Strategies for TCPA-compliant Texting and Lead Gen. Now it's time for some brief introductions. My name is Michael Peranto. I'm the Director of Professional Services here at Active Prospect. A little bit of background about myself. I've been in the CRM, contact center, and lead marketing space for over 13 years. I previously worked for CRM companies including Velocify and Shape Software, and I've done large implementations of contact center softwares, including Five9 and NICE and Contact. My previous work experience includes Cardinal Financial Company Limited Partnership, where I was the Director of Lead Marketing, where I oversaw a multi-million-dollar lead day. Now let's hand it over to Kristen McCormick from Hatch. Kristen, go right ahead.
My name is Kristen McCormick. I am the head of marketing at Hatch, and I've been in marketing for about 9 years now, kind of in a wide array of settings, local marketing, SEO, enterprise, agency. My focus throughout all of those years has been on content. That is kind of my wheelhouse, and I'm really excited to be here today.
Great. Thank you so much, Kristen. I appreciate that. We do look forward to hearing more about you and Hatch later on in this episode. So now let's move it over to Brian Behan from Socius Marketing. So Brian, real quick, just introduce yourself and give us a little bit of background around Socius Marketing and EverConnect. Brian, go ahead.
Sure, Mike. Thanks a lot. I appreciate it. My name is Brian Behan. I'm a senior digital marketing consultant at Socius Marketing. I have over 20 years of experience generating leads for the home service industry. I come from a canvassing background where I supplied canvassers what they went to the door with, and somewhere along the way, we wound up using those folks to generate leads for home improvement and home service companies. And then we wound up taking those folks and putting them in retail outlets like BJ's and Sam's Clubs. That's really where I learned that all home service companies are really in the lead gen business. I brought this vertical into Socius in 2008. Today, it's our largest vertical. We have lots of experience in working with over half the top 500 remodelers in the country. As a client-side agency, we collaborate with our clients on mobile-first lead generation designs, documented SEO plans, and transparently run paid ad campaigns. Our sister company, EverConnect, they offer TCPA-compliant performance-based lead generation, both call per lead programs and call per form leads. And they also have vast experience within the home services industry.
Great. Thank you so much, Brian, for that background. So let's just dive right in here to the content. So let's start off with you, Brian. Brian, can you tell us a little bit of the history of the TCPA as well as the future state of the TCPA?
Sure. The TCPA goes back to 1991, where Congress passed the law. Passed the Telephone Consumer Protection Act, and George W. Bush signed it into law. The law requires that businesses get explicit written consent before using automated dialer systems for telemarketing purposes. And as many people have found out over the past 30 years, failure to comply with these standards often results in penalties, litigation, and fees.
Right.
In terms of what we see coming down the pike, in 2023, the FCC made several very important changes to these standards that are important for everyone to be aware of and very important to be prepared for, because they're all going into effect January 2025. And one of the most important things is what's called one-to-one consent. And what that means is consumers must now provide express written consent to calls and texts from each business they wish to be contacted by. And this means that lead aggregators will no longer be able to operate in the same way that they've been operating up to now, where they're able to, sell leads to multiple brands and multiple companies.
Right.
The next thing that they did is they expanded the do not call to include both cell phones, smartphones, and texts, which obviously were not around 30 plus years for most of us. The next important change or update is they ruled that AI-generated phone calls also require written consent. And so that's covered by the TCPA, and that they instituted, or they're going to institute, something called call and text association, which says that calls and texts must be associated with the consent that was given. So what that means is if someone goes to a lead aggregator, fill out a form for someone to contact them for, say, let's say home improvement, they can only call that person about home improvement. They can't take that lead information and call them about real estate or anything else other than that. And that's also a big change. The last kind of big thing here is they've really put some more parameters around disclosure. I think we've all been playing a little bit of games with disclosure over the years, and they really buttoned that down. And now disclosure must be clearly and conspicuously disclosed to consumers that they may receive robocalls and robotexts from the marketer that they're filling out a form on.
Great. And, I really think, Brian, those points that you covered, there are some things that really, from a lead generator or a lead provider's perspective, that, if you are purchasing leads, you should be talking with your lead generators and your lead providers now, as opposed to waiting into January to start working on this. So some things that you really want to think about with this. Number one, you want to make sure that within their lead form and the disclosures that you are appropriately capturing one-to-one consent. It needs to explicitly list in the disclosures the organization that they are providing the consent to. Number two, you want to make sure that whoever your lead generator or lead provider is properly recording and storing the event of the consent within their platform. So one of the changes for the FCC rule requires that both the buyer and the seller of the lead have to have record of consent. So you both need to have that record, and you both need to be using technologies that allow you to acquire that. So Active Prospect, we have a product called Trusted Form that both the lead generators and lead sellers can use, where they can generate that certificate, pass that certificate over to you, and then you need to store that. I also recommend, if you are storing a certificate, to store that in your CRM system and downstream data warehouses for reporting purposes. Now, one of the things too to think about with this is that you want to make sure that when you are implementing these changes early, that you talk to them about when they are going to make this change. So why is that? There are certain organizations that when they receive consent from a consumer, they believe that they can contact them up to X number of days from the time that they have received consent. Under the FCC ruling, it actually doesn't specifically state that it only applies to leads that are generated after the rule change in January. So what does that mean? If I, as a company, if my legal team has interpreted that I can contact leads up to 90 days from lead submission, then I need my lead providers to make this consent change 90 days early. So just think about that. You want to start having these conversations with your providers. Now, Brian, what do you think is going to be some of the impacts of one-to-one consent on lead generators and marketers?
Sure. From a marketing's perspective, certainly one thing that we anticipate is an increased lead cost from lead aggregators, because lead aggregators are going to have to operate differently, and they're likely going to have to increase the cost per lead they're charging to cover lost revenue. Conversely, you would expect to see better lead quality, because remember, the lead forms, people are going to be picking particular brands, a brand or brands. So there's going to be an expectation by the person that filled that form out that XYZ brand is going to call, as opposed to the way it works now. And the way it's always worked is you don't really necessarily know who is going to call when you fill that form out. So it should be a better quality lead. The next thing that we anticipate is a potential increase in opportunity for larger companies with better, well-developed brands, more resources, bigger budgets. All of these companies will have their own professional websites. They're likely investing in SEO and going after the organic side of search, which will bring down their overall cost per lead. They're certainly running their own paid media campaigns, either themselves or through a professional agency like Socius. And many of these companies are so big and have so many salespeople to feed that they're also buying leads from lead aggregators. And if you think about the way it's going to be moving forward is people are going to have to select a brand. So if I go to a lead aggregator and I come on a landing page and there's 6 brands, and I don't know 5 of them, but the 6th brand is a household name with an awesome reputation, who do you think is going to get, the majority of those those one-to-one consents. So it's very, very important for small and medium-sized companies to realize this, that it puts them at a disadvantage, and to really focus on start building out your brand. The next thing that we see, and the final thing I'll talk about regarding this, is a potential disruption of sales to those companies that really rely on bulk lead lists or are just overly dependent on buying leads from lead aggregators.
Yeah, and Brian, I think there's a couple other things that I thought of with the FCC's one-to-one consent change. Under the old model where a consumer would go through a form, right? They would click on submit, and in the disclosures, it would list, a couple hundred companies that they could potentially be sold to. Through that process, the consumer would get a lot of phone calls, they would get a lot of text messages, and it would actually cause consumers to get angry in certain circumstances. Mm-hmm. And they would go online, they would leave bad reviews for organizations because they didn't know who was calling them. But the first person they could identify, they go, oh, okay, that's the one who's doing it. I'm going to go leave a bad review for them. So we think that I think that you will see less of those reviews. And I also think from an employee perspective, the ones who work in an environment where they're currently calling on shared leads, I actually think their experience in general as an employee will improve, because they should be calling consumers that expect them to call. And so they should be able to have a better conversation overall. So with that in mind, we've got a little slide here for you. So what are some recommendations from Socius Marketing, Brian?
Sure. These are just some things like a TCPA checklist to be ready. And the first thing is retain proof of consent, because both the lead seller and the lead buyer must retain proof of consent. And as Mike mentioned, this is where Active Prospect has some very nice solutions that if you're not aware of, you should really look into. The next thing is you want to do a vendor review all of your vendors' action plans for staying compliant with upcoming FCC one-to-one consent rule changes. Yep. Next, you want to have your lawyers probably get involved in this. Review all lead disclosures, ensure that all the disclosures on your lead forms and your vendors' lead forms capture one-to-one consent, and use clear, conspicuous disclosures. Meaning that disclosures should be easily noticeable, understandable, and unavoidable in all interactive mediums. And the last one I think is a big thing as well. It goes back to the branding. It's very important moving forward more than ever to really invest in yourself, invest in your brand. Consider branded campaigns where the consumer is specifically selecting your brand. Those leads might be a little bit more, but they're going to be better leads. Run advertising campaigns yourself. Do your own Google ad campaigns or Facebook ad campaigns, or turn to an agency like Socius Marketing for that. One way you can invest in yourself is invest in a professional website. Invest on ongoing SEO. If you can build out an authoritative website on the organic side of search and you're also buying leads, it's going to drive your overall lead costs down. We often refer to the organic side of search as the value side of search, because you don't have to pay those clicks. You just have to earn them. Lastly, consider pay-per-call campaigns. EverConnect's got some great pay-per-call campaigns. They have their own call center. Well, they'll actually drive branded leads. They'll screen those leads to your criteria, and then they will send a hot transfer call right to your call center. Excellent way to generate exclusive leads for yourself and also focus on your brand. One thing that Socius Marketing can do as a premier Google partner is we're able to go to Google and we're able to get free budget recommendations for either our clients or, in this case, for the people on the phone today. And what we're offering at Socius Marketing is, if you're interested, we can get you a free paid Google ad budget that will give you projections on what your overall opportunity is to drive leads through Google in your marketing areas for each of your products and services. And then we can do projections on how much those leads would cost you. If you know your numbers, which I'm sure most of you do, in terms of what percent you're issuing, demoing, selling, and what your average sales price is, we can drill it all the way down to projected marketing costs for you. So if that's something that sounds like you're interested in doing, there's a little button that just popped up on the screen. You would just click Get Started. That will drive you to a landing page that you'll fill out. It will come to me. I'll follow up, find out what products and territories you want to target, and we can schedule a meeting to review from there.
Great. Thank you so much, Brian. I really appreciate you going through all those recommendations and providing your insights. So right now we have our first poll question here on the webinar. The question is, how has the upcoming FCC's one-to-one consent rule change affected your organization's marketing efforts? So please take a look at the answers on the poll and fill in the one that best applies to your organization. Towards the end of the episode, we will pull up the poll results and we will review each one of them. So now let's move on to Kristen McCormick from Hatch. So Kristen, can you provide us with just a brief overview of the services that Hatch provides, and then provide us with some thought leadership that your firm has experienced around obtaining consent from customers?
Yeah, I would be happy to. So Hatch is an AI communication platform for sales and service teams, primarily for larger businesses like with call centers or multiple locations. And we offer AI-powered text, email, and voice communication. And what I want to say is that it is the type of communication that we facilitate is the communication that gets people to respond and convert and stay with you. And so what does that look like today? It's super personalized. It happens over multiple channels. It's followed up on, businesses are still kind of afraid to bother their customers or their leads, but actually people need follow-up because they're so distracted today. And that is consistent across the entire customer journey. And so this is pretty much impossible to do manually as a human being. And that's why we have automation, and then AI kind of takes that a step further. So that is Hatch in a nutshell. It's basically personalized messaging at scale. And to kind of connect back to some of Brian's points, I do want to say that with this FCC ruling, the value of buying leads, you're still going to be able to buy leads, but to Brian's point, it's going to be really important to focus on your organic channels, generating leads from your own website. This is also important from a privacy standpoint in terms of cookies and third-party based cookies and first-party data collection. And so the other part of that too is that with fewer leads available, you will also need to increase your conversion rate. So we may see higher conversion because they know who they're selecting. But it's also going to be important for you as a business to make sure that you are capitalizing on those leads that you do reach. And again, that is something that Hatch, as a text first strategy, multiple channels is important, but text first is really one of the key things that customers need today. It's convenient, it's fast, they respond, they may communicate later on other communication channels, but text is really that really gets the response and the conversation started. So I just wanted to kind of bridge that and also talk about how the TCPA is now getting highly more focused on texting compliance, which is what we're going to be talking about today.
Yeah. And, Kristen, I think it's really interesting what you brought up, because tools like Hatch, they're an enhancement to a salesperson's experience, right? When you're generating leads, I've worked with companies that generate thousands of leads. I've worked with companies that generate 100 leads on a regular basis. It's very difficult to do the follow-up yourself, picking up a phone, typing in a text, or writing it. You want to use automated tools to assist you with your texting and communication strategies. It's just an enhancement. It gets the customer to respond. From there, if there's difficult questions, there's things that your employees can answer. But, it helps to take out some of that busy work, that's in place. Yeah. And, that combined with, an appropriate CRM contact strategy, that includes like email drip campaigns, et cetera, can be a very, very powerful tool. I'd really like to get your thoughts on, you talked about obtaining the appropriate consent and really thinking about like from a texting component as well. What are some things that, some of the texting carriers are doing when you join their network initially in regards to vetting your consent and on the websites?
Yeah, so this is the tricky part. So we've got compliance ramping up, which means, you've got to focus more on converting your clients and your leads, which means you need to focus on the channels that they use the most. And one of them is text, and compliance is ramping up on text too. So that's the conundrum that we're facing. So what we've been seeing, and this kind of started, I would say, a year ago, there was a wave of, TCPA has always existed. It has existed since, I think, 1991. But in recent years, it has come to be very explicit that this is applying to text as well. And text for a long time went unregulated. So now it's kind of like there's some remedial activity happening. And so what we saw several months ago was this new 10DLC registration process, which essentially they kind of made it into a requirement. So there were always the TCPA regulations, but now it was like, if you want to start using this provider to text your customers using a texting platform, you need to be registered. And the registration process essentially was like, are you TCPA compliant? And so what we're seeing now is we've got what it comes down to is, if you have a texting provider, you'll submit a form to your texting provider, and then the texting provider, so like Hatch, for example, it's called a campaign service provider, they will interface with the mobile carrier to get you approved. And that carrier is actually individually vetting your website and making sure it's compliant and up to standards, and continually going back and making sure you're staying compliant as well.
Great. And I think we have a slide here to talk about some of the different components here that carriers use and Hatch recommends. Let's just go ahead and bring that up here.
Yeah, so this is the overall I've kind of bucketed out into 5 things. So that 10DLC registration is what I just referred to. So anytime you want to use a texting platform, you've got to get registered for 10DLC. And that just stands for 10-digit long code. It's not necessary to know exactly what that means. And then what they look for on your website are these things. The 3 middle bullets are what they look for on your website. That's an SMS-specific terms and conditions page, an SMS-specific privacy policy page, and then your website forms need to have the right opt-in verbiage, and then your message campaigns themselves have specific requirements. I will be putting a link in the chat, and we can share it later as well, to the comprehensive checklist, because each one of these has their own checklist. So what I want to do, though, is focus on the last 2, which is your website form verbiage and your SMS consent, your SMS content requirements. So you can go to the next slide and we can talk about that. And before I do just want to also, I know it's confusing, these FCC regulations. We've been talking about lead buyers and lead sellers and that one-to-one consent. And so there is that scenario where if you are buying leads, then you do need to make sure that your lead aggregator is obtaining the right consent and that you're also getting that documented consent. But we're now talking about what you can do on your own website to make sure you're capturing consent. So this goes back to what Brian was saying, where you've got to have good SEO, you have to have a good website, you have to have good branding, start running ads. All of those channels will filter traffic to your website where you can capture leads there with a form that has specific consent. So that's what I'm referring to. And this is the stuff that they look for when they are vetting your business. And this is something that this is built into the onboarding process with Hatch. Any good texting platform is going to make sure that you meet these requirements. So I'll just go through them here. This is the verbiage on your form. It doesn't look very pretty, but know that everybody has to use it now. So this is kind of the standard, and people are starting to kind of look for that. Like, they want to make sure that their privacy is being protected. So there's a bullet list here. You need clear opt-in messaging or a checkbox. So right now, like if you've got a submit button, then there needs to be a clear verbiage that says, by clicking submit, you are authorizing so-and-so, or by checking this box, making it very clear and conspicuous. And then explicit mention of text or SMS. So not just like this company can contact you, but like via text message, the company name, not we, but your actual company name. And again, there are people vetting these businesses. It's not like an algorithm. It's not like there are people going in. So like these details matter. the purpose of the campaign. So in the example we're showing here, ABC company to reach out to you via call, email, or text with information about your project needs. That is an example of the purpose of the campaign. Message frequency. You can say message frequency varies, but you do need to include something in there about message frequency. And then the next two bullets are exact verbiage. You need to say that message and data rates apply and consent is not a condition of purchase. And then you need a link to your SMS privacy policy page and your SMS terms and conditions page. So that's why those are two additional requirements that in the checklist that I'll provide in the link, which actually I'll put that in the chat right now while I'm thinking of it. I'm probably going to throw off my train of thought here, but okay, there is the checklist. That also contains your privacy policy and terms and conditions checklist with examples and a template for the terms and conditions. You can have a privacy policy, like an overall privacy policy page, and in that page have a specific section that's related to SMS. Or you can have your own SMS page, but as long as there is a specific SMS section, that's what they're looking for. And then also there's an optional option to say, we will not sell your data, some sort of privacy statement. And you can also tell them that they can opt out at any time.
Yeah. And Kristen, I think this part is very interesting because really the last, we'll say like 6 months to a year, we started seeing a little bit more focus by the different carriers that are out there on, the information that was submitted on a previous form for 10DLC or for customers who are currently submitting information on the 10DLC. And what I think is very important for our audience to understand is that when you submit that form, that will be presented, to that carrier. That carrier is going to go to your website. They're actually going to look at your form. They're going to look at your disclosures. They're going to look at your terms and conditions and privacy policy and make sure that it meets every single one of their requirements. And if it doesn't meet their requirements, they're actually going to ask you to correct it. And without correcting it, you just can't text. And so this is something that, I've seen organizations when they sign up for like a CRM service or a service like Hatch, they fill out that 10DLC form and then they get initially rejected and they're getting asked to do all these things. Well, not only is this helping you to stay compliant, but this is also something that's actually a requirement by the carriers that deliver those text messages. Yep. So it's important to understand that organizations like Hatch or any of these CRM firms, they're not doing this to penalize you. They're not trying to be negative and not get you to text. It's simply a requirement that these carriers have. Right,
exactly. And there are platforms that don't have these compliance requirements, and so they may seem more appealing because there's less red tape to get signed up. But in the long run, it's not in your best interest. And we have actually seen some platforms that offered texting back when 10DLC ramped up, they actually had to stop their entire text offering because they couldn't keep up with the compliance. And the other part of that too is when in the 10, and I think we'll get to this in a little bit, but in the initial 10DLC registration process, you either get approved or you don't. So when you've been not approved. But now when they're going back and re-vetting, they are filtering out certain messages. And by filtering, that means they're blocking them from reaching your customers for very specific reasons. And it's not on them to tell the business that your message did not get delivered. So it's on the campaign service provider to make sure that the messages are getting delivered and that they are compliant. So that's the other thing is, Hatch has built in requirements in our campaigns so that that even if you accidentally left something out, Hatch would make sure that your message requirements were being met.
Yeah, and I think that's very important. And I think on the next slide, we're going to talk a little bit more about this too, which is really where, you've got the initial vetting that goes through from your carriers, from that 10DLC form, but the carriers are also actively looking at the contents of your text messages to make sure that they meet certain requirements. So there are situations, and Kristen, you're going to cover this as well, where if your message contains certain language in it, certain carriers, they could be T-Mobile, AT&T, Verizon, whatever, may actually block that message from being delivered because it doesn't meet their requirements.
Yep.
So I know that it's something that is frustrating. It's something that's really we'll say about the last year, we've seen a lot of this filtering that's starting to go on. And Kristen, if you could just go through and give some good key points to cover to help with deliverability and compliance.
Yeah. And also something that you had mentioned to me, Mike, which is that it's not always just the carrier that you're using. It could be the carrier of the recipient of the text message, not letting that message come through. So it's happening from both sides. So there's two main requirements, first and foremost. And you can see in the slide here that the first text of any campaign needs to identify your company name, no matter what. So if you do a campaign for if somebody fills out a lead form and you have an automated campaign going out saying, hey, thanks for reaching out, you have to include it there. If later on down the line, you have that contact entered into an old follow-up campaign, that's considered a separate campaign. And that's a new text. And that means that needs to include the company identifier there. It also needs to include the opt-out instruction. So that is what you see there, reply stop to stop text communication. So this word has to be in all caps. There is an exhaustive list. It may vary depending on who your carrier is. For example, for Twilio, this is their list of stop words. Stop, unsubscribe, end, cancel, quit, stop all. Any of those will work. Also, just no matter what word you pick, you don't have to tell your provider, as a business, you don't have to tell your texting provider what word that is. But regardless of which word you pick, the word stop will always work. So if you tell your customers to respond end to stop communication and they respond with stop, that'll still work. Again, it has to be in all caps. And I would also caution you to just be aware of the verbiage that you're using here. The easy recommendation is reply, stop to unsubscribe. Now, for Hatch, for example, our customers are using text messaging not as a mass blast for a promo thing, or if they were to say text stop to unsubscribe, that would actually, if I were a homeowner, for example, that would make me think, oh, I didn't subscribe to anything. No, I'm not looking to get. So be careful of the wording that you use. So in this example, we have reply stop to stop text communication, because the way that our customers use text is very relationship building, one-to-one, personalized communication. And this is what you want to indicate in that text.
Yeah, and I think it's important that you bring this up. One thing that I would like to add here when it comes to your text messages, there are certain industries that do have licensing requirements as well. So, I know in certain financial services industries, if you've got a license number and things like that, you want to make sure that those are appropriately communicated and displayed within your text messages. And I do think it's also, we've had some questions in the past, and this can vary depending on your legal department's interpretation. The first text message should have your company name and the unsubscribe option. There are some lawyers who believe you don't need the opt-out on every text message subsequently after that. That can vary. It depends on your own legal team's interpretation for the opt-out clause. Yep. All right. So let's move into the next slide here in regards to just some tips and tricks for sending text messages.
Yeah. So what we kind of just covered was these are the key requirements, but as we've mentioned, there are individuals going in and reading these messages, and not all it's just not all black and white. It's not an exact science. So there are things that we're noticing from a customer standpoint, what we're noticing with our accounts, reasons that messages are getting blocked. So I'm going to cover a few of those. The first one is on your screen now. So this is to keep your text conversational in nature and not salesy. So you can see on the left, this is a very, it's almost like an e-commerce sounding, get the, things are in all caps other than the unsubscribe thing. There's stars, we see all kinds of stuff. And And like you just can't do that. And people are looking out for that. So keep it conversational. And on that point too, this is something that we always educate our customers on, because it's so tempting to want to, when you're reaching out, you want to like give them all the details and make them trust your business. But really, like, because customers like text messaging because it's so short and it's simple. And so we always encourage you to go for the response and not the sell. So a short message that just says, hey, thanks for reaching out, like text us back with what you're looking for. Or if you're following up on a quote, hey, do you have any questions on the quote I sent over? Very short. You're just getting them to respond. Even if it says, I can't talk right now, that is an engagement. That is a response. It'll become an A/B conversation from there. And so that is, Hatch, we have templates. So we have AI bots that actually do the texting, which is great. They know best practices because it's, it's computed into their heads. But also the templates that we offer for the campaigns are based on these best practices, and they allow you to keep it short. That is also another tip too, is to keep your messages short. There's character limits of like 320 characters or less. Honestly, I would say even go shorter than that. 150 characters, like keep it digestible. And if you have the right messaging system like Hatch, like you can send a short message, and if they don't respond, that's great. It'll keep reaching out. It'll reach out the next day with a slightly different message, a shorter message, or, you don't have to cram it all into one message. And then avoid mentioning other phone numbers in your text messages. So sometimes people the number that they're texting from is like a company number, and then they're like, text me back if you want to talk, and it's like their individual line. Those messages are getting filtered sometimes. Things like filtering evasion. This is another, you could get filtered for trying to avoid being filtered. Yep. So if you like accidentally misspell stop, like, you don't want to do that, because if somebody wants to unsubscribe, they want to unsubscribe. You're not going to change their mind. But any form of that, or finding ways around different thresholds, like they pick up on that. And so the last kind of 3 points I'll say are being mindful of your metrics. So that's your message volume, that is your opt-out rate, and that is your delivery rates. If you have the right texting platform, you will have visibility into whether your messages are being delivered or not. Just like when you're when you're texting somebody, your friend, and you see the delivered right underneath that message. Yeah. Hatch, for example, has that delivery status. And then if it doesn't get delivered, you can also click into it and see why. Because sometimes it is a compliance issue. Sometimes it's just not a valid phone number. Be mindful of your message volume. So there are some providers that have thresholds for how many texts you can send in a day in order for them to get delivered. And this is actually a good thing. Like that mass text blast isn't going to be that effective because, again, customers want personalized messaging. So it's really important to have a platform that allows you to really segment and target and tailor your messaging. And that'll make for fewer, smaller, but more effective campaigns.
Right. And, Kristen, I think some of those points are very important to understand. Like if you mentioned like text blasting and really just kind of, potentially even overly texting consumers, you really wouldn't need to think about when you are creating your text message campaigns to think about, the age of the lead. If you've got leads that are 180 days old, 200 days old, it's probably not a good idea to be blast texting those individuals. Mm-hmm. You want to make sure your messaging is personalized to that individual. It makes sense for the campaign. It's tied back to even the initial form that they filled out. So if you're using a lead generation firm like Socius Marketing or something like that, when they submit the form, your messaging should be tailored to what they submitted their information on. Yep. And part of this is just so good for the consumer, and it also will make it where you have a much lower opt-out rate. And these carriers, when you have a high opt-out rate, when you get above certain thresholds, some of those carriers turn you off. So all of a sudden, you'll start seeing a certain amount of your text messages. I've seen situations where it's as high as 33 to 66%, just completely turned off because you were spamming a bunch of people. They marked you as spam, and then therefore your text messages don't deliver. And I think those are very, very important points. Kristen, is there anything else that you would like to add or for our audience?
Just on that last point for the for that like targeted messaging, I want to highlight the importance of being able to integrate your text platform with your CRM and your lead sources. So for example, Hatch allows you to directly integrate with Angie or with whatever your website source. So you can actually create a campaign that says, hey, we got your information from our website. Like, thanks for filling out our website form, or we got your, thanks for clicking on our Google ad. Like, that is very personalized. And similarly with your CRM, if you want to, there's a lot of business to be had from old unsold estimates or old leads, but it comes down to that messaging. It's not like if you send a mass blast out, you're going to get a bunch of engagement. But if you send out a tailored campaign to 100 people that, have an open estimate from 6 months ago, like, hey, we never got a chance to complete your project. Are you still looking to have that project done? And like something so it's important to be able to integrate with your CRM so you can build audiences based on exactly the criteria you're looking to target. But yeah, on that note, I think we are going to put a poll up on this, not a poll, but a call to action up on the screen. So if you are interested in getting a demo with Hatch, like I said, we enable compliant, personalized texting at scale. We actually offer AI-powered text, voice, and email. But like I said, text is really the primary mechanism there that you get responses from, but we'd be happy to walk you through the platform and show you how you can engage and improve the customer experience while also saving time and conserving resources in your business or call center.
Great. Thank you so much, Kristen. And again, in our audience, if you want to get a demo of Hatch, feel free to click on that button and fill out that form. So now we're going to move on to the poll results. So our poll that we asked earlier in this session was, how has the upcoming FCC's one-to-one consent rule change affected your organization's marketing efforts? The answers that we had was it has had no impact on my marketing efforts, which was 19%. The second option, we've had some challenges with how we are capturing consent with our model, had 43%. The third option was dramatically. We've had to do significant planning and changes to our overall model to ensure we are capturing consent, which was 19%. And then the last one, which is I would be interested in learning more about solutions to capture one-to-one consent for my leads. Now, when I look at these results here, I am a little bit surprised at the number of answers for number one, which is it has had no impact on my marketing efforts. I would expect that to be a little bit lower, actually. But the rest of the ones are pretty much in line with what I would see. We have seen organizations where they've had to make dramatic changes to how they are generating leads and the practices for how they sell leads. We've seen organizations that have to go through the disclosures, review them with their publishers, and review them internally. So these results are pretty much in line with what we see, except for the first one there. All right. So now that we've gone through the poll results, let's go through some questions. So what we're going to do, we're going to look at the questions, and if there's any ones that we can answer on this call, we're going to go through them, and then from there we'll go into our closing. So let's just go ahead and look through here.
It looks like there's some questions in and around exactly what one-to-one consent means, Michael.
Yeah.
This question is the one-to-one consent, say they consent to solar. It sounds like they're saying, can any solar company call them, or is it one-to-one consent? They have to go to ABC Solar if ABC Solar was given one-to-one consent?
Yeah, that's a great question. So when you are providing consent on a form, it's not to a particular industry, if that makes sense. It's actually directly to the organization that is going to be doing outreach to you. So as an example, if I had company name ABC, that customer, when they are going through the form, the disclosures would list company name ABC in it. So they're providing express written consent for that company to outreach to them. Now, I think it's important to understand that, and Brian, I think you brought this up as well in the beginning, there are requirements in the rule that when the customer is filling out that form for you, that your communications to that customer are around the stuff that they saw on the page. So as an example, if a customer goes through and they fill out a form for windows, you can't go and try and sell them homeowners insurance, in that regard. So that's just some things to think about there.
I do have a question here. If the SMS terms and conditions and privacy policy need to be standalone pages, we covered that earlier, but just in case you missed it, they can be standalone pages, or they can be a section on your overall privacy policy page or overall terms and conditions page. As long as there are explicit SMS terms, conditions, and privacy policy, then you're covered. And like I said, in the guide that we shared in the chat, there are examples and templates that you can use for the SMS terms and conditions. We don't have a template for your privacy policy because that is highly specific to your business, but the requirements are listed on there.
Here's another interesting one maybe we can talk about. There seems to be a lot of discussion about consent being associated with brands rather than some other definition of an entity. The term is not used in the FCC order. Is your position that the consent is associated with a brand?
So that can be a very tricky question. And some of this has to do, there's also, especially like within the insurance industry, there are some things with individual agents and the agencies that are involved with things like that. If you are unsure of what that consent should be, of who should be listed in the disclosures for that consent, I would honestly recommend going and seeking legal counsel on that, because that's not something that you can answer carte blanche across all the industries. This is something that really you would need to seek legal counsel to get their determination of it.
I thought that was an interesting question. Yeah,
it actually is a great question, and it kind of goes back to when you think about the FCC ruling, what they were really trying to accomplish was that they didn't want a situation where a consumer was providing their consent and then all of a sudden they were being contacted by a bunch of entities that they didn't know. The FCC and the FTC have really, really focused and been cracking down recently on robo-dialing, robo-texting. They want everything to be around consent. And, that's really the purpose of this ruling, is to help make sure that consumers are appropriately providing their information and consent to be contacted to individual entities. And so one thing that I think we really need to take home with us is that, when you are looking at a lead form and the leads that you are receiving or the ones that you are generating, you need to make sure that the language that is in your disclosures meets the requirements, not just for this FCC ruling, but also some of the things that Kristen talked about as well with the carriers, right? So you should be getting these disclosures on a regular basis. Active Prospect does have a product that does that as well. It's called Trusted Form Verify. And what we do is that whenever a lead is submitted, we actually capture those disclosures as well. And you can either approve or reject those disclosures. So you can review these with your vendors and make sure that they are all compliant. All right.
There's a question here about written consent and what exactly that means. And it's a great question. I actually, when I was first learning about this, I was like, what does prior express written consent mean? And so I'll just walk through it. So prior means prior to you actually contacting them. So you cannot text them and say, is it okay for me to text you? Because you don't have consent to text them and ask them. So that is the prior part. The express part is that they have voluntarily given that consent. So that's where that form comes into play. Written means it's documented. So it doesn't mean it needs to be a handwritten certificate like on a scroll, written with a feather pen. But it does mean that it needs to be documented. So to Mike's point, especially with Trusted Form, you need to have a documented certificate that says this person filled out this form at this time.
Yep.
And then the consent, of course, is yes, you can text me.
Yeah, and I think it's important to understand that the express written consent can typically just be covered with disclosures that are on the lead page, right? So when the consumers initially filling out that form. They provide their contact information. They check the box that says, yes, I consent to be contacted. Then they submit. They've got those disclosures there as well. And that's usually where you would list that, part of the requirements of the disclosures is you are providing your express written consent to be contacted by company ABC, et cetera.
Somebody also asked if where to put that form verbiage, like below or above the button. I don't think, for what I know, I don't think it matters as long as it's on there and just very visible and obvious. So it kind of depends on your form, what it looks like and where it fits into your form structure.
Yep.
So that shouldn't be a problem where you place it.
Yeah, and this is something where, if you have a question on the placement of the disclosures, that's something where I just recommend go seek legal advice on it, right? Mm-hmm. If you think, hey, I think it should be above or I think it should be below, if there's any sort of confusion on these things, that's when you want to go talk to an attorney, get their feedback on it. There are attorneys that are out there that actually specifically specify that are very specific to TCPA, and that's what their practice is. Those are the ones that you can get that type of consultation on. Mm-hmm. All right. So we're getting towards the end of this webinar here. So Kristen and Brian, I really appreciate you taking the time to share your insights with our audience today. I thought there was a lot of things that were covered. I thought they were very helpful. We do have a final poll question here before we close. Are you interested in learning more about Active Prospects product solutions? And then as a last item here, we have another upcoming webinar that's on July 10th. We do look forward to seeing everybody joining that webinar. And thank you all for joining.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Have a good one.
You too.